Alexander the Great. Imagine ruling the whole world. That's what Alexander the Great set out to do 2,300 years ago. He led his army from Greece to India and built the biggest empire ever seen. What we know about Alexander comes from a collection of ancient biographies made of some parts legend, some parts myth, and some parts history. The true accounts and the myths of the beautiful godlike hero, Alexander, are now hopelessly tangled together, much like the Gordian knot, and have been so for over 2,000 years. Alexander's beginnings. Alexander was born in Macedonia, the most powerful state in Greece. His father, Philip, was the king. Philip had once been a handsome, dashing general, but now he was a battle-scarred old soldier with a lame leg and only one eye. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was tough as well. She had a fierce temper and was quick to have her rivals and enemies put to death. She was very fond of poisonous snakes. It was said that she even kept snakes in her bed. With parents like these, it is no surprise that Alexander was destined to perform deeds which would live in song and story and would cause poets and musicians much toil and sweat to celebrate them. Alexander and Bucephalus. Even at the age of 12, Alexander showed how brave he was. One day he went with his father to see a fine new horse. A friend of his father was offering to sell the horse for 13 talents. But when they went into the field to try him, they found him so very vicious and unmanageable that he reared up when they tried to mount him and would not so much as endure the voice of any of Philip's attendants. In disgust, Philip ordered the horse to be led away. Alexander, who stood by, said, "What an excellent horse they are losing! If only they were brave enough and smart enough to find out how to manage him." Philip at first took no notice of what he said, but when he heard him repeat the same thing several times and saw he was so upset to see the horse sent away, Philip asked, "Do you criticize those who are older than yourself as if you knew more and were better able to manage the horse than they?" "I could manage this horse," replied Alexander, "better than others do." "And if you do not," said Philip, "what will you forfeit for your reckless daring?" "I will pay," answered Alexander, "the whole price of the horse." At this, the whole company fell laughing, and as soon as the wager was settled amongst them, Alexander immediately ran to the horse, and taking hold of the bridle, turned him directly towards the sun, having, it seems, observed that the horse was disturbed at and afraid of the motion of his own shadow. Then letting him go forward a little, still keeping the reins in his hands, Alexander stroked the horse gently until it was calm. At last, with one nimble leap, Alexander swung himself up onto the horse's back and rode around the stable yard. Philip and his friends looked on at first in silence and anxiety for the result, till seeing him turn at the end of the track and come back rejoicing and triumphing for what he had performed, they all burst out into acclamations of applause. And his father, shedding tears, it is said, for joy, kissed him as he came down from his horse, and in his transport said, "O my son, ask for thyself another kingdom, for that which I leave is too small for thee." Philip gave his son the horse to keep. It was named Bucephalus, and it was to carry Alexander on all his greatest adventures. Alexander and Aristotle. The young Alexander was not just a fine horseman. He could run, wrestle, fight with a sword, play music, and sing. Philip hired a famous scholar named Aristotle to be the boy's teacher. From Aristotle, Alexander learned about countries and peoples outside of Greece. He learned to love all kinds of ideas and reading, especially philosophy. Alexander studied the ancient Greek epics by Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. In fact, every night when he went to bed, Alexander laid his copy of Homer's Iliad, along with his dagger, under his pillow. Alexander thought this work was a treasury of all military virtue and knowledge. Among the other pupils learning from Aristotle was a boy named Hephaestion. He quickly became Alexander's best friend. Their friendship was to last for the rest of their lives. Alexander had his first taste of war when he was only 16. He was left in charge of Macedonia while his father was abroad, and he led an army against a band of rebels and defeated them. But he had to learn about leadership very fast. In 336 BC, Philip was murdered, and Alexander became the new king of Macedonia. He was just 20 years old. The news of Philip's death spread quickly. His enemies in Greece saw their chance to break free of Macedonian rule. Alexander had to show that he was as strong and ruthless as his father. The biggest threat came from the city of Thebes. Its people rose in revolt against Macedonia and called on others to join them. At the head of his army, Alexander raced south and camped outside the walls of Thebes. He ordered the rebels to surrender. They refused. Alexander moved his troops to the city gates. Still, the Thebans would not give in. Then came a moment of luck. One of Alexander's officers forced his way inside the walls and began fighting for his life. Alexander had to help him. His soldiers poured through the gates and smashed the Theban army. Alexander ordered the whole city to be pulled down. Only one house was spared because a famous poet had once lived there. Alexander was now in control of the Greek states, but this was not enough for him. He swore to defeat all of Asia Minor and free it from the Persian Empire to the east. Many years before, the Persians had invaded Greece. It was time to take revenge. As for the size of his army, the lowest estimate puts its strength at 30,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, and the highest, 43,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. The money available for the army's supplies amounted to no more than 70 talents, and there were supplies only for 30 days. Alexander was already in debt. Yet although he set out with such slender resources, he would not go aboard his ship until he had discovered the circumstances of all his companions, and had assigned an estate to one, a village to another, or the revenues of some port or community to a third. When he had shared out or signed away almost all the property of the crown, Perdiccas asked him, "But, Your Majesty, what are you leaving for yourself?" "My hopes," replied Alexander. "Very well, then," answered his friend Perdiccas. "Those who serve with you will share those too." With this, he declined to accept the prize which had been allotted to him, and several of Alexander's other friends did the same. However, those who accepted or requested rewards were lavishly provided for, so that in the end, Alexander distributed among them most of what he possessed in Macedonia. These were his preparations, and this was the adventurous spirit in which he crossed the Hellespont. Once arrived in Asia, he went up to Troy, sacrificed to Athena, and poured libations to the heroes of the Greek army. He anointed with oil the column which marks the grave of Achilles, the great hero from his favorite work by Homer, the Iliad. And then he crowned the column with a wreath. He also remarked that Achilles was happy in having found a faithful friend while he lived, and a great poet to sing of his deeds after his death. Meanwhile, Darius, the king of Persia, had his generals gather a large army and posted it at the crossing of the river Granicus. Most of the Macedonian officers were alarmed at the depth of the river and at the rough and uneven slopes of the banks on the opposite side, up which they would have to scramble in the face of the enemy. And when his companion advised him against risking the crossing at such a late hour of the day, Alexander declared that the Hellespont would blush for shame if, once he had crossed it, he would shrink back from the Granicus. Then he immediately plunged into the stream with 13 squadrons of cavalry. It seemed the act of a desperate madman, rather than of a prudent commander, to charge into a swiftly flowing river, which swept men off their feet and surged about them, and then to advance through a hail of missiles toward a steep bank, which was strongly defended by infantry and cavalry. But in spite of this, he pressed forward, and with a tremendous effort gained the opposite bank, which was a wet, treacherous slope covered with mud. There he was immediately forced to engage the enemy in a confused hand-to-hand struggle before the troops who were crossing behind him could be organized into any formation. The moment his men set foot on land, the enemy attacked them with loud shouts, matching horse against horse, thrusting with their lances and fighting with the sword when their lances broke. Many of them charged against Alexander himself, for he was easily recognizable by his shield and by the tall white plume which was fixed upon either side of his helmet. The joint of his breastplate was pierced by a javelin, but the blade did not penetrate the flesh. 2 of the Persian commanders rode at him. He evaded the charge of the one and struck one who wore a breastplate with his spear. But the shaft of the weapon snapped, whereupon he fought with the sword. While he was engaged with this man, another rode up on the other side, and rising in his stirrups brought down a barbarian battle axe with all his strength upon Alexander's head. The stroke split the crest of his helmet, sheared away one of his plumes, and all but cleft the headpiece. In fact, the edge of the axe penetrated it and grazed the hair on top of Alexander's head. But just as the Persian raised his arm for another blow, a Macedonian hero struck first and ran him through with a spear. And at the same moment, Alexander cut down the other man with his sword. While Alexander's cavalry was engaged in this furious and dangerous action, the Macedonian phalanx crossed the river, and the infantry of both sides joined the battle. The Persians offered little resistance, but quickly broke and fled, and it was only the Greek mercenaries who held their ground. They rallied together, made a stand on the crest of a hill, and sent a message to Alexander asking for quarter. In this instance, he allowed himself to be guided by passion rather than by reason, led a charge against them, and lost his horse, not Bucephalus on this occasion, which was pierced through the ribs by a sword thrust. It was in this part of the field that the Macedonians suffered greater losses in killed and wounded than in all the rest of the battle, since they were fighting at close quarters with men who were expert soldiers and had been rendered desperate. The Persians are said to have lost 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. The enemy leader, Darius, the great king of Persia, was yet to be found and defeated. Swiftly the Macedonians swept aside the rest of the strong Persian army. But Darius was not there. He had fled to Syria. Alexander followed him. The quickest way to Syria was through a narrow mountain gap called the Cilician Gates, which was only as wide as 4 men. Alexander made a surprise attack at night. The Persian guards were so terrified that they ran away. Alexander caught up with Darius. His attack was swift and deadly. He captured the king's camp, but once again Darius ran away, leaving his soldiers to be killed by the invaders. After this great victory, Alexander marched down the coast. He captured town after town until he came to the port of Tyre. This was built on an island, and so its people thought they were safe from attack. They mocked Alexander when he sent offers of peace. They even threw his messengers over city walls. But Alexander was determined to capture Tyre. His men built a road out over the sea to the island. This took more than half a year, for the sea was very deep. Giant catapults hurled stones to smash holes in the walls. Then wooden towers were pushed along the road. Alexander's soldiers poured out from them into the city. After a savage battle, the people of Tyre were forced to surrender. Alexander moved on southward to Egypt, the richest land on the Mediterranean coast. Here there was no need to fight. The Egyptians welcomed him as their new pharaoh or king. But Alexander had two important things to do. First, he wanted to make sure of his power by founding a great new city. He sailed down the Nile River to the coast, where he ordered the city to be built. He even laid out its boundaries by taking flour from his soldiers' packs and sprinkling it on the ground. The city was called Alexandria. The second journey was more mysterious. Alexander rode far out into the baking desert to the little town of Siwa. Here was a shrine where a great god called Amun could foretell the future. Alexander asked Amun whether his conquest of Persia would succeed. The god told him that he would conquer the whole world. Now it was time to finish the war with Darius. At last they reached a plain near a village where they saw yet another Persian army. It was enormous. There were more than 200,000 Persians. Some rode on war horses, some in chariots, and some on elephants. The rest were foot soldiers. Alexander had only 47,000 men. The battle began. At first, the Persian cavalry drove back the Macedonians, but then Alexander saw a gap in the center of the enemy line where Darius stood. Mounted on Bucephalus, he rode straight at the king. His horsemen galloped after him. In his golden armor, Alexander was a terrifying sight. Darius, in panic, turned and fled. Many of his followers also ran away, pursued and hacked down by the Macedonian cavalry. It was a triumph for Alexander. He had smashed Darius's army and was ready to seize control of the giant Persian Empire. There was no stopping Alexander now. One by one, the magnificent cities of the Persian Empire surrendered to him. The grandest of all was Persepolis, the capital city. In its vast royal palace, Alexander found an amazing store of treasure. This was soon loaded on to pack animals and carried away. Then Alexander ordered the palace to be set on fire. Flames roared through the beautiful building, destroying everything but the stone walls. At first, the soldiers thought it was an accident and ran to get water to throw on the flames, but Alexander stopped them. He wanted the palace to burn. It was a sign that he had utterly defeated the Persian king. Meanwhile, far away, Darius lay dead. He had been stabbed by his own generals. Now Alexander had no rival. He could call himself the great king of Persia. But Alexander wasn't done yet. He and his men marched on and on, continually east, defeating armies, founding great cities, amassing treasure, and spreading the Greek way of life, sometimes called Hellenism, all over the known world. He was inspired in his leadership and fearless in battle. His ambition was boundless. He ruthlessly suppressed all who dared to rebel against him. He led violent and bloody campaigns past Persia and Egypt, all the way into India and Babylon, destroying others in his path and establishing new cities to glorify his name. By the time of his death, at age 32, his empire encompassed 2 million square miles, most of the known world. His achievement was and remains unparalleled. He was worshipped as a god during his lifetime, and his legend has only grown since.